for many years now, far more than when we were kids, there's been an increasing lack of economic and business acumen at the top of our political and media class. Not just our political class, but our media class as well. And I've got the scars on my back, right? I have absolutely spilt my life's blood trying to get the British media class to take economics and business seriously. And there are one or two of us who managed to have some impact, but God, do we have to fight to get airtime and attention. Newsrooms are filled with people. Nothing wrong with a humanities degree. I read a few books myself. But filled with people who don't only not know anything about economics and business, they wear it as a badge of honor that they don't want to know anything about economics and business. And that spills over into our political class as well. The media that we consumed as kids, Brendan, whether it was, the business sections of the Sunday papers that were absolutely chock full of insights, of reports about particular companies, the program that we saw on the television, not least the BBC, the Money Programme, Working Lunch, all these kind of, major documentaries on economics and business. All that's now completely gone. Our TV executives seem to think that a business program is lots of people dressing up, dragging carry-on luggage and saying you're fired to each other. Nothing to do with business at all. It's utter bollocks. Sorry, but it is. So you've got this anti-commercial sense at the top of our economics and business class, as if, numbers don't matter, as if finance doesn't matter. Now, I don't want to come across as, somebody who's over pecuniary, some desiccated calculating machine, in the great phrase of John Maynard Keynes. And just as a brackets there, let me just pay tribute to my dear departed friend, Professor Lord Robert Skidelsky, the great biographer of Keynes. And it was one of the honours of my life to work closely on that biography with Robert. But I don't want to come across as somebody that's just fixated on the numbers and financial markets, because I'm absolutely not. And anybody that knows anything about me will tell you that. But we are now ignoring financial markets to the point way beyond irresponsibility. It is reckless, absolutely reckless. Now, there are people in the House of Commons who are really getting their heads around what's happening. And again, this isn't a tribal point. I think the leader of the opposition, I think the Shadow Chancellor, the Shadow Business Secretary, Mel Stride and Andrew Griffith, I think they're extremely financially literate people. They both run, those two people backing up Kemi, they both run businesses. They both know what they're doing. I have to say, not a tribal point. At the top of reform, you've got people like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice who seriously know their way around a balance sheet and understand the difference between a stock and a bond, which often isn't the case. But we just have this complete lack of understanding across so much of politics, particularly among the ruling party. No one on the front bench has ever run a business. They're all public sector trough nuzzlers. Again, we need public sector people, but we need a mix. We need a mix. And in contrast to the Blair government, to really drill down into why all these parlour games are dominating, I reported closely on the Blair government. As you may remember, I was a political correspondent on the FT at the end of Major into the Blair government. Blair and the people around him always ensured, the political people around him, there were serious financial people in the room when the big decisions were made. And I've talked about who they were elsewhere. I'm talking about people like Gavin Davies, who was a partner at Goldman Sachs, big trader, the late Derek Scott, who was a very highly regarded city economist, chief economist at KPMG. There were always people around that understood the dangers and perils of overspending, over-borrowing. And anyway, New Labour were miles away from that because they inherited a national balance sheet where debt was 35 to 40% of GDP. They inherited the economy off Ken Clarke and the Tories after those Thatcher reforms, shoot me down, had revitalised the British economy. Not saying they weren't painful, but what we had before was a lot more painful. IMF crisis 76, winter discontent 79. Let's not over romanticize, right? Britain in the late 70s, the music was great, right? and we were young and free as individuals, but the economy was a nightmare, and it was deeply painful for people like, my family at the sharp end. It was not romantic at all. And during the 80s and into the 90s, ordinary people got a chance to own stuff, to build themselves up, to run businesses. And Blair inherited all that. Under Blair, not because of Blair, in fact, in spite of Blair, the economy grew 2.5%, 3.5%, sometimes 4% a year during Blair's first term because of what they inherited. And because at that stage, Gordon Brown hadn't got his mitts on it and started overtaxing and overregulating. So this is what we have. We have a general lack of understanding among our political and media class of finance and business, and particularly financial markets, and particularly the link between government borrowing, government debt service costs, and the potential implications when the big institutional investors, the pension funds, the insurance companies, the sovereign wealth funds start charging you more to borrow. It's a general lack of understanding, and that lack of understanding within the Labour Party, and particularly at the top of the Labour Party, is generationally profound.
I think that's really well put. And I often think I'm not someone who knows the economic side of issues as well, nearly as well as you do, which is why I follow your work, so I can get a better sense of what's happening. But I do remember being, when we were younger, as you say, when the economy was a central question of British politics. I mean, it was covered on the news. People would talk about it. If there were strikes, that was about economic questions. If there was a crash of some sort, it would be on the front pages for days and days and days. People actually talked about it, but it seems the economy has been taken out of the political realm. I mean, I don't know if this is related to making the Bank of England independent and kind of shunting the economy off to this discrete question that experts should bother themselves with, while politics becomes about flim-flam and ridiculous battles between just certain factions. But that kind of parking of the economy away from politics and away from public discussion, that's been a growing trend, hasn't it? And it's landed us in a lot of trouble in the sense that we're not talking about the things we should be talking about.
Indeed, I don't think it's because of Bank of England independence. I think the Bank of England, since it became independent in 1997, there's been a lot more discussion of interest rates, for instance, because before it was all behind closed doors, the so-called Ken and Eddie show. Ken Clarke, Eddie George, respectively, the Chancellor in the mid-90s and the Governor of the Bank of England. So I don't think it's because there's less to report. There's a lot more to report. Crikey. The economy's stupid, as Clinton's chief political advisor, James Carville, said while campaigning for the comeback kid, as he was then known, to become the US president. It's now, it's the economy stupid, cubed, globalization, international trade, the extent to which ordinary people have to do more in terms of their own personal finances, self-invested pensions, mortgages, fewer people in council houses, so they actually they're on the open market. There are people around. You have to hand it to the likes of Martin Lewis, who has, really made a few quid for himself and tried to popularize personal finance. Even he has trouble with his tremendous communication skills. There are a few of us trying to get stuff out there, but it is very, very, very difficult. I'm very, very proud of the Telegraph. I think we still have a meaty, decent business section, and yet, in terms of the numbers of people reporting, no disrespect to any of them, I think they do a fantastic job. There's so many fewer reporters now just covering business than we had when I started writing my column there, 25 years ago. Even than 5 or 10 years ago, the Observer hasn't got a business section, it just closed it down. The Sunday Times is still hanging in there. So there's very little media focusing on this stuff, even though society needs it even more. Why? I think it's a kind of a combination of what another late great economist, not particularly sharing, I don't particularly share his politics, but a brilliant writer, J.K. Galbraith, he called it affluenza, a kind of illness that comes from societies being wealthy. And when, and the media itself is so now unrepresentative of ordinary people, plenty more women, plenty more brown people on screen, fantastic, you know, bring it on. But as we've become more kind of as more kind of gender and racially diverse, we've become socio-economically far less diverse in terms of our media. You know, there's a lot of people from very, very wealthy backgrounds in the media. Only they can afford to be there. You know, journalism increasingly is a kind of, you know, it's a kind of lifestyle hobby for the listless children of the 1%, you know, rather than what journalism should be. It should be an absolute engine room of social mobility, filled with the sons and daughters, first generation at university people who, you know, can bring from their lives real knowledge, their socioeconomic knowledge, their regional knowledge. All that's gone. All that's gone. And that really, really matters. And I'm afraid, you know, a few bungs here from the BBC for local papers, you know, get out of the way. Get out of the way. All the free stuff you're providing is killing the market for news. And again, I'm not an enemy of the BBC. I want the BBC to do well. That's a different conversation. Anyone wants to, just Google my name, BBC. You can read stuff that's out there. But it is a kind of cultural shift in the media, a cultural shift in our politics. The fact that we've been doing pretty well for a number of years, a kind of overemphasizing of feelings over facts. All these trends are feeding into a situation where we are now, you know, in a very precarious financial situation, and yet our media class is just, you know, in a bubble of self-indulgent, internecine warfare over basically who gets the red box and the car and the six-figure ministerial salary. The rest of the country, the rest of the world is looking on saying, what's happened to the Brits?